Hi everybody. In this video, I'm just going to do a quick overview of how living things harvest, use, regenerate energy for their own purposes. And when I say energy, the kinds of things I want you to be thinking about are the energy that you need to, say, move your muscles around, or the energy you need to think, send nerve signals in your brain, or even in order to build something. So if you have a muscle of a certain size, how do you build the proteins you need to make them bigger? So when we talk about this type of energy, it's in a chemical form, and that chemical form, and this is something just to memorize, is a chemical called ATP. Now that stands for, and please don't memorize this, adenosine triphosphate. Nothing that you need to know the specifics of for this class. But you do need to know that there are two different versions of this chemical. ATP is something you want to think of as kind of like a charged battery. And if you have ATP around, you can use that energy in order to make a muscle move or to make a nerve fire, something like that. But every time you use it, it gets kind of discharged into a different chemical form called ADP. And so again, every time you need to move something, build something, think about something, you're going to be using up ATP and discharging it into something else called ADP. Now, this begs the question, how do you recharge the ADP back into ATP? And that's really what we're going to be talking about in this little mini lecture. This process where you can take ADP and recharge it back to ATP is the whole point of a process that you've already heard of called cellular respiration. And this is basically how we take the food we eat or the food we build if you're a plant and rip it apart and harvest that energy in order to regenerate the ATP. Now, the food that we tend to talk about, even though you can eat all sorts of things, whether it's starches or fats or things like that, the central molecule we're going to be talking about is glucose. And yes, this is the exact same glucose that we've talked about in the past. That is the end product of photosynthesis. All right, so the same sugar that we've talked about over and over again. And so whether you're a plant or a fungus or an animal or something else, you can take that glucose, right, that you've eaten or built, and you can, in something like a 25-step chemical process, break it all the way down to the simplest possible ingredients. In fact, the same things it was built from. You can rip the glucose all the way down back to CO2 and H2O. And please do take a look at that photosynthesis equation in gray, and you'll see this is basically the opposite. We can rip the glucose back all the way back to CO2 and H2O. Now, the whole purpose of this is to take the energy and use it to build ATP back up again from ADP. Now, in terms of comparing this to photosynthesis, remember photosynthesis required sunlight, solar energy in order to sort of fuel it. But in this case, since we're ripping the glucose apart, tearing it back down, we can harvest energy from it. Now, there is a catch. And you may have noticed something missing in the glucose breakdown process, or a couple things missing. One is if you really want to do this complete breakdown, you're going to need some oxygen. And so this is why this whole process has a name called aerobic cellular respiration. Now, if you can't remember the word aerobic, just remember it has the word air in it. And the air we're talking about is O2, oxygen gas. This is why we breathe. This is why every time you inhale into your lungs, the oxygen goes into our bloodstream. It's so that all of the cells in our body can continue to break down glucose and use that energy to regenerate ATP. That's the whole point. Now, the catch is that not all organisms have access to oxygen all the time. And in fact, this is true of you too. Some of your muscles, in certain cases, don't actually have a whole lot of oxygen in certain moments. And so there's an alternative pathway, which is just half of the breakdown process. It's not the complete breakdown of glucose all the way to CO2 and H2O. It's just a part-way process. And in us, the glucose is ripped in half into something called lactic acid. Maybe you've heard of that, maybe you haven't. it is something that, can build up in your muscles if you are doing a sprint. You're doing a kind of workout where you're out of breath. Now, this process, only half breakdown of glucose, only generates a little bit of ATP, just a couple ATP per glucose. And that's very different from aerobic cellular respiration, which generates a massive quantity, something on the order of 30 ATP per glucose. So this process, which doesn't have oxygen involved, is much less efficient. And so this process is called anaerobic cellular respiration. But you don't need to know the intricate details of these processes, or even, the intermediate that you can see listed there called pyruvate for aerobic. What I really want you to keep in mind is you can either completely rip apart glucose if you have oxygen present, and that allows you to build a whole lot of ATP, or if you don't have oxygen present, you can do a partial breakdown from glucose into half a glucose called lactic acid, and, recharge a little bit of ADP back into ATP. These are the processes we use to build the ATP that fuels everything we do in our bodies. And this isn't just true of us, this is true of plants, bacteria, and everything. And keep in mind, in terms of the food we eat, I'm guessing you're not all just eating pure glucose in water. The foods we eat tend to be, things like bread, which are made of starches. And if you didn't remember this, starch is just a big long chain of glucose. So anytime you eat bread, you just rip that bread in your intestines into glucose, and then that allows you to do this process. If you're eating, fats, oils, things like that, those can be broken down into the intermediate of this process, and you can run on those too. Protein's a little bit more complicated to rip apart, but all the foods we consume can be used to fuel this process of cellular respiration, which gets us the ATP that we need. Hope that helped everybody. See you next time.